Helios 522, do you read?
High above Athens, fighter jets track a 737 as it circles the city.
522, do you read? Over.
There's no answer from the passenger plane, but there is someone at the controls. More than 100 people are on board.
Everybody's mind was going to hijack or terrorists.
There is one person moving in the cockpit. Repeat, there is one
What
person.
happened to the crew and passengers?
522, do you read? Over.
And who is flying the plane?
Helios 522, do you read? Over.
Mayday, Mayday.
Early morning, August the 14th, 2005. The cabin crew of Helios Airways Flight 522 are preparing for their trip from the island of Cyprus to Athens, Greece.
Sure is a beautiful day. Maybe I shouldn't have come in.
Andreas Prodromou is 25. He isn't supposed to be working today, but he's taken the flight to spend some time with his girlfriend, who also works for Helios.
It's the sort of day I'd like to be out flying.
Oh, you will, Andreas.
Prodromou is a flight attendant now, but he has bigger plans. One day, he wants to fly for Helios.
Το όνειρο του ήταν να γίνει επαγγελματίας πιλότος
His dream was to become a professional
για πολλούς
pilot.
λόγους. Εγώ
Personally,
ήθελα να
I
είμαι
wanted
στη
him to stay
δουλειά
in the family
μας, να μείνει
business.
μαζί μου,
We
αλλά
often talked about
παρόλο
this.
που έκαμε κάποιο διάστημα κοντά μου,
We've got company.
Stay warm at the back.
I will.
See what happens.
In the cockpit, the flight crew is occupied with the daily routine of preparing their jet for takeoff.
Right today.
Captain Hans Merten is an East German, a contract pilot hired by Helios for the busy holiday season.
Are you almost through? Pardon? You almost done. Nearly. Well, the overheat lights.
His co-pilot is from Cyprus. Pambos Charalambous has been working exclusively for Helios for the last 5 years. Before beginning any flight, crews are required to perform dozens of checks on various pieces of onboard equipment.
Oxygen mask stowed.
It's a routine but necessary procedure.
Doors closed.
Sorry, could you store trays? Pull your seat back.
Helios is a charter airline with low-cost fares to Greece. It's a summer weekend and the plane is filled with families. In all, there are 115 passengers on the morning flight.
If you need any more help, let me know. We're just about to take off.
They are low fare, no frills. They don't even serve you refreshments during small sorts of flights. But they offer another possibility for the budget-minded traveler.
Paros Dimitriou and Maria Rikou are traveling to the Greek island of Patros. They've just got engaged.
They booked this holiday a month or more than a month ago. It was like a honeymoon for them.
Flight attendants, please take your seats. Prepare to take off.
Just a few minutes after 9 in the morning, Helios Airways Flight 522 lifts off into the bright sunshine.
Nicosia Area Control, this is Helios 522. Request cruising at 340.
Helios 522, you are cleared to climb to 340. Have a good day.
Set 340. 340.
Minutes into the flight, the plane is still climbing towards its cruising altitude. Suddenly, an alarm blares in the cockpit.
What is it? The takeoff config warning?
The flight crew is confused. The takeoff configuration alarm normally only sounds on the ground. It tells pilots their jet isn't ready for takeoff. The crew doesn't know why it's sounding now. Uncertain what the problem is, the captain radios the Helios Operations Center at Larnaca Airport back in Cyprus.
Operations, this is Flight 522, over.
Flight 522, what can I do for you?
We have a takeoff config warning on.
Pardon?
Our
Takeoff config warning is on.
I'm sure it's nothing. I'll let you know when we level off.
With the first alarm still beeping in the cockpit, things become even more confusing. Their master caution alarm goes off. It could indicate that some systems on board are overheating.
We now have a master caution.
I'll get you an engineer. 522, just a minute. I find him very hard to understand. His accent is quite thick.
Flight 522, what can I do for you?
The ventilation cooling fan lights
are off.
Sorry, can you repeat?
While the pilots and ground engineers try to troubleshoot the two alarms, most passengers have no idea there's a problem until...
Everyone, stay calm. But please remain seated.
Everyone, please put the oxygen masks on completely over your mouth and nose.
The protocol was immediately to secure yourself, grab an oxygen mask, stay in your seat. If you can help passengers without getting up, you could help them, and you should help them, but you would not risk the safety of any cabin crew member to go and help a passenger which is 5 or 6 rows further up.
Their procedure would be to grab their mask, don it, and wait for the aircraft to level off or commence with a descent.
No one in the cabin knows what the problem is. They're waiting for information from the cockpit. The pilots are unaware that the oxygen masks in the cabin have dropped, and they still don't know why their takeoff configuration warning is on, or why their systems are overheating.
Both of my equipment cooling lights are off.
This is normal. Can you please confirm your problem?
But the engineer on the ground is struggling to get a clear picture of what's happening in the air.
They are not switched off.
Can you confirm that the pressurization panel is set to auto?
Where are my equipment cooling circuit breakers?
Behind the captain's seat. Can you see them?
What's going on?
There's something wrong with the electrics on 522.
I had something to pick up from operations, so I was there. I figured, oh, not again, one of our problems. So I left. Oh, good luck.
The problem doesn't seem serious, but as the plane continues to climb, passengers still haven't received any information from the cockpit.
Helios 522, can you see the circuit breakers?
And now the engineer on the ground loses contact with the aircraft.
Helios 522, can you hear me?
It's less than 30 minutes after takeoff, and Flight 522 is still on course. The plane is high above the Mediterranean Sea and headed straight towards Athens. August the 14th, 2005. A Helios Airways 737 with 121 people on board is circling in the sky near Athens.
Helios 522, can you hear me?
Shortly after leaving the island
Over.
of Cyprus, 2 different alarms had been triggered on the plane. The flight crew was trying to solve the problem with the help of ground engineers. But now radio contact with the plane has been lost. Air traffic control can't get any response from the captain or co-pilot. The flight to Greece normally takes an hour and a half. But the passenger jet has been in the air for over 2 hours, circling in a holding pattern.
We heard that there was an airplane which was flying into the Greek territory and had no communication. Everybody's mind was going to a hijack or to terrorists.
More than 3 million people live in Athens. A plane slamming into the city could cause an incredible loss of life.
This is a runaway aircraft. It's a possible hijacking or it's a possible terrorist act, so let's involve the military.
The Greek Air Force scrambles 2 of its most sophisticated fighter jets to investigate the Helios plane.
Helios 522, do you read? Over.
But the pilots aren't getting any response. One of the jets flies closer to the cockpit. Someone is in the co-pilot's seat, slumped over the controls. But there's no sign of the captain at all. The fighter pilot radios air traffic control in Athens.
Athens ACC, there is one figure in the cockpit of Helios 522. He appears non-responsive. Athens ACC, checking the cabin.
He can see passengers in their seats, but none of them reacts to the presence of the jet. Then the pilot sees someone moving in the cockpit.
Athens control, there is one person moving in the cockpit of Helios 522. Repeat, there is one person inside the cockpit.
Helios 522, do you read? Over?
Helios 522, over. Flight HCY 522, this is Athens radar control. How do
The
you hear?
F-16s continue shadowing the jet, but there's no response at all from the cockpit.
One of them was actually in a shooting position behind the 737. The other one was nearby the cockpit and he was trying to communicate visually with the person in the cockpit.
Suddenly, the 737 turns left and begins to quickly descend.
Athens ACC, Helios 522 turning sharply. Following down.
From more than 10,000 meters, the plane drops towards the ground.
There is no structural failure, there is no fire, there is no problem, obvious problem from the external view with the plane.
Helios 522, over. Do you read?
Helios 522.
Do you read? Over.
Then, 2,100 meters above the ground, the person in the captain's seat acknowledges the fighter jet for the very first time. But no words are exchanged. Neither the fighter pilot nor local air traffic control can make radio contact with the jet. Just after 12 o'clock, almost 3 hours after it took off from the island of Cyprus, Helios Flight 522 slams into the ground.
Athens ACC, Helios 522 is down. Repeat, Helios 522 is down on Grammatico Hill. Over.
Fire and rescue workers rush to the crash site. There are no survivors. Flight attendant Lazaros Temetsian is stunned by what he hears at the company's operations center.
It was the most chaotic scene I've ever seen. When I went back, our operations controller said that he'd lost the aircraft and his eyes, he was starting to cry.
Helios is a small company with just 3 jets. Members of the cabin crew have been working together for years. For Paul Simeonides, news of the crash is particularly terrifying. He's a flight attendant for the airline, and so is his fiancée.
I think that must have been the worst 30 minutes of my life following that first image, because Victoria was flying that morning to Glasgow. I had everyone and his brother, every person we knew was calling me up to find out if I'm alive, if Victoria is alive, what happened, why it happened.
At first we said it takes 1 hour and a half to go to Greece, so probably it's not that plane. And it took about 2 or 3 hours later to know that Paris and Maria was on the plane that crashed.
Andreas Prodromu's father didn't know his son had been called to fill in on Flight 522.
I was told that Helios aircraft was lost by radar, and air controllers couldn't contact. I got worried. I called Andreas' phone. He always had it on. And unfortunately, he wouldn't answer. After that phone call, I felt as if the ground was pulled out from under my feet.
It's the worst air crash in the history of Greece. Most of the 121 victims are from Cyprus. The small island nation declares 3 days of mourning following the crash. It's an eerie disaster. For over an hour, air traffic controllers watched the passenger jet fly in radio silence closer and closer to Athens, with no idea what was happening inside the jet. Now, piece by piece, investigators are trying to find out.
So we climbed over the hill, and there we were, facing this situation, which was beyond any description. I saw a great area in front of me, which was burning. It was black. Burning, people spread, pieces of the airplane.
Είναι πράγματι μια
It is a truly nightmarish
εφιαλτικό
sight.
τοπίο.
I hope that I never experience it again.
Εύχομαι να μην τη ξαναζήσω.
It was terrible.
Δεν είναι
Just
κακή στιγμή,
terrible.
πάρα πολύ κακή στιγμή.
Investigators immediately start looking for the cause of the crash. In the early days, their efforts take a frustrating turn. They recover the box containing the cockpit voice recorder, but the recorder itself has been thrown clear.
It was difficult for us because we first found the case of the CVR very badly damaged, and we could not find the machine itself.
Investigators need to know what happened to the pilots. Without the cockpit voice recorder, they have little to go on.
So keep looking. Let's hope we can find it.
Bodies recovered from the wreckage are brought to the offices of Athens' chief coroner. Autopsies add more mystery to the case. Everyone on board the plane was alive at the time of the crash.
Υπήρχαν σενάρια
There were scenarios at the
εκείνης της
time that they
στιγμής
had all died in
ότι ήταν
midair.
όλοι νεκροί στον
the
αέρα.
truth-
Η αιτία
They
θανάτου
did
είναι
not die from
σαφής,
inhaling a toxic substance in the airplane.
που την
From an
επανέλαβα πιο πάνω.
explosion.
Δεν
people
υπάρχει
died
καμία
on
απολύτως αμφιβολία. Οι άνθρωποι σκοτώθηκαν.
But if the passengers were alive the entire flight, why didn't the pilot of the fighter jet see any activity inside the cabin? And who was at the controls as the jet circled over Athens? When investigators find tissue samples in the remains of the cockpit, they make a stunning discovery. The person at the controls of the plane when it crashed was flight attendant Andreas Prodromu, a last-minute addition to the cabin crew. But why was he in the cockpit? Was he trying to save the plane? Or did he deliberately fly it into the ground? Several days after finding the outer case of the cockpit voice recorder, investigators find the recording itself. When Chief Investigator Tsoulakis listens to the final moments of the flight, it answers a vital question.
Mayday. Mayday.
This was no
Helios
terrorist
Airways
act.
Flight 522.
Prodromou was
Athens.
calling for help.
Mayday.
Tsoulakis hears 5 separate Maydays on the tape, even though none of them were heard by the air traffic controllers.
Από την πρώτη στιγμή που άκουσα ότι κάποιον πρόσωπο ήταν στο
From the first
πλειοκτήριο,
moment that they saw someone in the cockpit,
δεν ήταν δηλός
believe me, I was
άνθρωπος.
certain it was Andreas.
Ήταν γνώστης του αντικειμένου
wasn't a coward.
του αεροπλάνου. Πίστευα ότι θα είχε τη
He knew
δύναμη να
something
μπορούσε
about
να
planes,
κάνει
and
οτιδήποτε
he had
αν
the capacity to do
έμπαινε
something.
πιο νωρίς για να μπορέσουν να σωθούν οι άνθρωποι μέσα στο αεροπλάνο.
In fact, Prodromou had his commercial pilot's license. It was the first step towards his goal of becoming a captain for Helios.
It's the sort of day I'd like to be out flying.
Oh, you will, Andreas.
But all of his training wouldn't have helped save the jet. When he was seen at the controls, Flight 522 had been in the air for almost 3 hours. And the reason the Helios plane seemed to veer away from the F-16s following it was because its left engine was out of fuel. No matter what caused the alarms to sound, the ultimate reason for the crash was simple.
The DFTR and the CVR gave us absolute proof that the plane ran out of fuel. And this was the cause of the crash.
Scheduled as a 90-minute flight, the plane didn't have enough fuel to stay in the air for over 3 hours. But why had the plane flown so much longer than it was supposed to? Tsoulakis now knows who was in the cockpit of the plane and why it crashed. But to fully understand the mystery, he needs more information. His investigators uncover a suspicious history of maintenance issues with the Helios jet. Issues that could help explain what happened on Flight 522. Less than a year before the crash, the same aircraft had suffered a rapid decompression. Lazaros Temetsian worked on that flight.
I was in the back of the aircraft at the time. There was a loud metallic bang, a clanging sound, and the oxygen masks dropped in the cabin. Every step I was taking was difficult. It was hard to move, hard to breathe. In fact, I was starting to pant. I was panting for air.
As the plane began an immediate descent to 3,300 meters, all Temetsian could do was remain strapped in and wait. Once the plane reached a safe altitude, Temetsian inspected the rear door and was shocked by what he found.
I noticed that the aft service door was not fully locked. The hinges on the top and the bottom of the door were kind of displaced. I could pass my hand right through.
There were no injuries, and the plane made an emergency landing, and the door was inspected. But this wasn't the only problem crews had with this plane.
We would record faults in the cabin logbook constantly, and nothing would be done to rectify even these small little problems in the cabin. Engineers would take months to rectify even the slightest problem in the cabin.
There were more recent problems as well. A Helios ground engineer tells Tsoulakis that on the very day of Flight 522, the 737 had another problem with its back door.
When we checked the flight log for the trip, we saw that we'd have to do some unscheduled maintenance.
The plane had arrived in Cyprus just after midnight on August the 14th. The cabin crew had heard loud banging noises and saw ice on the rear service door during the flight. It was scheduled to take off again just hours later. Soon after it landed, engineers began checking the problem. To make sure there's nothing wrong with the seal on the door, the engineers run a pressurization test. During normal flight, a plane's engines force air into the cabin. To ensure oxygen circulates during the trip, small valves in the rear allow some of it to leak out.
A pressurized airplane essentially is sort of like a pressurized can. Well, we pressurize the airplane so that the people inside can survive the environment that the airplane likes to operate in.
Switching digital pressure control unit from auto to manual.
Without the jet's engines running, the engineer uses the plane's auxiliary power unit to force air into the aircraft, and the cabin is pressurized for several minutes.
It's like looking for a leak in a tire. In this case, what you're having to do is pressurize the aircraft, use a barometer essentially to monitor the pressure inside, and look for leaks that way.
But there's no indication any air is escaping through the back door.
In this case, they felt that it was all right and they completed the test.
The entire jet seems to be in good working order. After performing a series of additional routine maintenance procedures, the engineers signed off on their technical log. Investigators are faced with a dead end.
So explain again how you tested the pressure.
An explosive decompression could have explained the tragic events of Flight 522. If the oxygen had been suddenly sucked out of the jet, everyone on board could have been overcome. But not only did engineers check the problem, when the F-16s approached the plane near Athens, no damage was seen. There was no indication that the fuselage was punctured.
Mayday.
Investigators are still struggling to solve the mystery. What had overcome the passengers and crew of Helios Flight 522? And why was one flight attendant apparently unaffected?
5.
The discovery of one small switch holds the key to the entire crash. The crash of Helios Flight 522 is one of the most mysterious air disasters ever.
Helios 522, do you read? Over?
All investigators know for sure is that shortly after takeoff, the crew stopped communicating with air traffic controllers.
Helios 522, over.
Mayday.
Then, after 2.5 hours in the air, one of the plane's
Helios
flight
Airways
attendants was seen at the controls. Eventually, the plane ran out of fuel and crashed, killing 121 people. But investigators are stumped. They still don't know what had happened to the plane's captain or the rest of the crew.
Tell me about what happened the day of the flight.
They concentrate on the conversation between the pilot and the Helios engineer shortly after takeoff. As the plane passed through 3,700 meters, an alarm sounded in the cockpit.
Operations, this is Flight 522, over.
Flight 522, what can I do for you?
We have a takeoff config warning on.
Pardon?
Our takeoff config warning is on.
Usually, the takeoff config warning is only triggered on the runway. But wreckage recovered at the crash site reveals no problems with the plane's flaps, landing gear, or anything else that could trigger the alarm. So why had it sounded? Chief Investigator Akrivos Tsolakis focuses on a small control panel found in the wreckage of the ravaged jet.
Are you sure this is the way it was found? It hasn't been moved at all.
We were lucky finding this panel, which had the switch on the manual position, was a major one.
Helios.
The P5 pressurization panel ensures that passengers have enough air to breathe, even at high altitudes. Normally, pressurization takes place automatically. As the jet climbs, its engines force air into the plane as they power it through the sky. But when the pressurization switch is set to manual, both the captain and co-pilot are responsible for maintaining the cabin atmosphere using a controller.
So explain again how you tested the pressure.
When I went into the cockpit, I turned the pressurization switch to manual.
Soulakis learns that during the early morning maintenance check on Helios 522, ground engineers had turned the P5 switch to manual. That allowed them to use the onboard generators to test the pressure seals on the plane's rear door without starting the engines. When the test was over, they didn't turn the switch back to automatic.
The procedure of pressurizing the aircraft has to do with setting the pressurization system from auto to manual. They were supposed to return the selector to the auto position.
Several hours later, when the flight crew entered the cockpit, the pressurization switch was still set to manual.
Lead air switches. It's bright today. Are you almost through? Pardon?
But neither the pilot nor co-pilot saw it. As a result, after takeoff, the cabin would not pressurize automatically. And the higher Flight 522 climbed, the thinner the atmosphere became. Not turning the switch back to automatic was a deadly, hidden danger.
Are you sure this is the way it was found? It hasn't been moved at all.
Soulakis believes this panel could be the key to the disaster. Leaving one switch on manual could have led to all the other problems the plane faced. To prove he's right, he takes an unusual step. 4 months after the disaster, he takes an Olympic Airlines 737 on the same route flown by the Helios jet. If he's right about what caused the crash, this plane should react exactly like the doomed airliner did.
Are we ready to go?
When there is a complicated accident like this, I think a reenactment should be performed. Of course, it's expensive to have a jetliner flying for 3 or 4 hours, but it is worthy if you have to come with some results which benefit to the overall investigation.
Make sure the P5 is set to manual. It's hard to see.
In the cockpit, Soulakis has the crew turn the pressurization switch to manual. A green light indicates it's no longer on automatic. But in the bright glare of an early morning departure, the light is hard to see. As the reenactment flight climbs, oxygen is thinning quickly in the aircraft. The same thing happened on the Helios flight, triggering an alarm.
What is it? The takeoff config warning?
The alarm sounded, and that alarm was misinterpreted. Most of flight crew, they will never face an alarm with no pressurization in all their flight career because it's a rare event.
Soulakis confirms that the alarm went off because of the dangerously low air pressure in the aircraft. But he also discovers that the sound itself is identical to the takeoff config warning.
We have a takeoff config warning on.
But even if the flight crew did misinterpret the first alarm, they still had another chance to determine what the real problem was. At almost 5,000 meters, the plane's master caution light flashed on and stayed on for almost a minute.
We now have a master caution.
But once again, the pilots misinterpreted the cause of the alarm. The master caution light can indicate that the plane's systems are overheating. But it can also tell pilots the oxygen masks are down. In this case, it was doing both at the same time. But since the crew didn't think they were having pressurization problems, they focused on the plane's cooling systems.
The alarm about the non-cooling was a side effect of non-pressurization. Actually, it was not really that there was a high temperature inside the avionics bay, but it was the sensors that they were supposed to measure the temperature and the pressure in that area sensed that something was wrong.
On the recreation flight, investigators monitor instruments recording the same events occurring on board their aircraft. At the same time, they also begin to feel the effects of the lack of oxygen.
The first feelings you'd start to have were your ears would pop and you'd start feeling pressure in your sinuses. As you climb higher, you begin to feel almost giddy. It's almost like having a couple of drinks of alcohol.
The dwindling oxygen levels could also help explain some of the crew's bizarre behavior. When the ground engineer asked about pressurization,
Can you confirm that the pressurization panel is set to auto?
Captain Merton ignores the question and responds with one of his own.
Where are my equipment cooling circuit breakers?
You really don't notice it at first. It's amazing how subtle it can be in the early phases. They'd start feeling dizzy. They begin to lose the ability to think coherently. In a way, it traps you into the situation. You can't react to anything. Eventually, you're going to lose consciousness.
Soulakis believes that the captain may have been checking on the circuit breakers behind his seat when he and the co-pilot finally ran out of air. And unlike in the cabin, the oxygen masks in the cockpit do not automatically deploy if the atmosphere begins to thin.
Helios 522. Can you hear me?
On the other side of the locked cockpit door, no one in the cabin would have known that the plane was now flying itself. Nor would they have realized that a limitation of the passenger oxygen system had sealed the fate of everyone in the cabin. Passenger masks are supplied by a chemical generator above their seats. But the generators only produce enough oxygen to last about 12 minutes.
Well, the problem with the passenger masks is, for one thing, they're not designed to keep you oxygenated at a high altitude. What they're designed to do is give you enough oxygen so that you can survive until the pilots get the airplane down to a low altitude. In almost every event where we've had a decompression, that's been perfectly adequate.
For those who did put their masks on, they would have remained conscious for several minutes until their oxygen ran out. Then they too would have passed out.
Once you get up to 34,000 feet, you're talking useful consciousness of 30 to 60 seconds. Most of the people, once the hypoxia begins to cause them to lose consciousness, they're just going to go to sleep.
Without a flight crew, Helios 522 would have continued to Athens on autopilot. When the crew didn't take control, the autopilot would have put the jet in a holding pattern as it flew over the airport. Exactly the same thing will happen on the reconstruction flight if cabin pressure isn't restored. Soulakis asks the co-pilot to reset the P5 panel to auto before the jet continues to climb to its cruising altitude of just over 10,000 meters. Then, as it approaches Athens, Soulakis also has an F-16 shadow the jet, performing the recreation. He wants to confirm that it was Andreas Prodromou at the controls of Flight 522 when it went down.
We dressed one of our guys with the uniform of the steward, and he came in, he sat on the captain's chair, and the F-16 was looking at him. He was confirming that it was exactly what he saw on the accident plane.
The reconstruction also answers another question about the tragic fate of Helios Flight 522. The cockpit voice recorder picked up several strange noises. They're heard just before Prodromou enters the cockpit. Soulakis confirms that these sounds were made by Prodromou using the electronic keypad to unlock the cockpit door.
We confirmed all those items and during the enactment flight, and it was very, very useful. It filled a lot of gaps we had.
Okay, take it down.
For Chief Investigator Tsolakis, the reenactment flight has been convincing. There was no dramatic cabin failure. Instead, a series of small mistakes and misunderstandings had led to the worst air disaster in Greek history. "15 months after the crash, Greek authorities released the official report on Helios Airways Flight 522. But mysteries remain. What was happening in the cabin while the doomed airplane flew towards Athens? And why was Andreas Prodromou the only one conscious at the very end? The crash of Helios Flight 522 was the worst disaster in the history of Greek aviation. Like many crashes, it was a fatal combination of mechanical problems and human error. The final accident report details a tragic series of oversights and false assumptions made by the flight crew. Problems that could have been easily prevented turned deadly for all 121 people on board.
Where are my equipment cooling circuit breakers?
Behind the captain's seat. Can you see them?
But what the final report does not do is explain what happened in the cabin of the plane. What actions did the flight attendants take? And why was Andreas Prodromou still conscious after almost 3 hours?
Mayday. Mayday.
Interviews with Helios safety instructors and crew members paint a tragic picture of what may have occurred.
Everyone, please put your masks on. We're not sure what the trouble is, but remain calm and please remain seated.
Prodromou was sitting at the back of the cabin. When the oxygen masks fell, he would have waited for instructions from the cockpit. The flight attendants sitting at the front of the plane would have done the same, but none of them would have waited forever.
We made it an issue at Helios to emphasize that cabin crew should not entirely depend on their procedures, but to think on their feet and to adapt to any impending situation.
In most depressurizations, the plane descends quickly. But as minutes passed on the Helios flight, the plane continued to climb. Unsure of what was going on, Prodromou would have tried to contact the flight crew.
Captain Merton.
But he gets no response.
Can you give us an update, please? Captain Merton.
With no word from the cockpit, he would have soon realized that this was not a typical depressurization.
When there was no call out from the cockpit and the aircraft didn't start an emergency descent, there was absolutely no protocol. They would be winging it.
By now, Prodromou must have felt that something was terribly wrong. But to find out what the problem was, he had to leave his seat.
The oxygen available on the 737 is, of course, the dropout oxygen. 10% of those masks are available for the crew in case of a depressurization incident. There are extra masks per every seat row.
Taking advantage of the extra passenger masks, he could have made his way to the front of the plane, a process cabin crew called monkey swinging. But if more than 12 minutes had passed, his girlfriend and the other flight attendant may have still been in their seats, and like the passengers, overcome by hypoxia. But Prodromou was a scuba diver and a former soldier in the Cypriot Special Forces. His training may have helped him to stay alert a little longer.
Andreas
was not a coward. He was a brave person. Fearless, brave and very calm.
But to survive after the passenger oxygen system stopped working, he needed another solution. The 737 had 4 portable oxygen bottles. Each one could last more than an hour. All 4 bottles were found at the crash site. 3 of them appeared to have been used. While the F-16 pilot saw Prodromou in the cockpit just before the crash, it may not have been the first time he had gone in. As he did at the end of the flight, he could have used the security code to unlock the door earlier.
The procedure would be to enter the flight deck via the cockpit door. Initially to bang on the door, and then, if no response is forthcoming, to enter the code and enter the flight deck.
During the accident investigation, DNA was discovered on an oxygen mask in the cockpit that matched the co-pilot's. It's possible Prodromou used it to try and revive him.
You can still revitalize somebody for quite an extended period of time if you get to them before major brain damage is set in. And that's somewhat a variable situation depending on the person, depending on how long they're exposed to a high altitude.
But if he was in the cockpit earlier, why did he leave? No one will ever know.
Probably was a little bit disoriented, a little bit confused. He's reacting a lot slower than he normally would.
What was his state of mind? What was his physical condition? We think that he knew what was really the problem, but is that the real situation? It's a real question.
After 3 hours in the air, everyone who didn't have bottled oxygen would have been unconscious. As it approached Athens, Flight 522 was now a ghost plane.
Most of the victims, they probably still had heartbeats when the airplane crashed, but almost certainly were in an irreversible coma.
Hypoxia is no more painful than falling asleep. But for Andreas Prodromou, the flight must have been a nightmare. As the F-16s roared to meet the jet, and with his oxygen running out, he must have known that he too was almost out of time. Yet to the very end, he didn't give up. Prodromou made one last attempt to save the plane. When he returns to the cockpit, the young flight attendant who dreamed of becoming a pilot calls for help. But no one can hear him, probably because the radio was still tuned to Larnaca, the airport on Cyprus where the flight had taken off. Fighting hypoxia
Helios
and
Airways.
struggling to control an airplane larger than any he had ever flown, Prodromou was in an impossible situation. Even if he could have landed the plane, it was now too late. Flight 522 was out of time and fuel. There are pictures of Andreas in Cyprus, in the cemetery where he and his girlfriend Charis are buried side by side.
Σαν πατέρας προστιμούμε το γιο μου. Σαν
As his
πατέρας,
father, my son
ο
is
γιος μου είναι πάντα
in front
μπροστά
of
μου.
me. Wherever I go, he's always there.
Σ' άφησε ένα μεγάλο κενό.
He left a very big gap.
Δυστυχώς, δεν θα ξεπεραστεί ποτέ.
We will never get over it.
There are pictures in Greece, too. On the hill north of Athens, where Helios Flight 522 crashed, there are faded photographs of many of those who died. Bleached by the brilliant Mediterranean sun, they gaze over the rugged, ancient terrain, silent witnesses to one of the world's most bizarre and tragic airline disasters. The Boeing 737 is one of the most popular passenger jets in the world. Around the globe, the plane has carried more than 12 billion passengers. It's the backbone of the aviation industry. But in 1991, something happened on board a 737 that sent shudders through the world of aviation.
Oh my Lord.
A deadly crash has investigators scrambling.
There was a time when I had doubts that we'd be able to solve it.
It was like he was tracking a serial killer.
The hunt for answers will take 10 long and grueling years. The fate of the airline industry hangs in the balance. And the mystery isn't solved until more than 150 people are dead. (9:40 a.m., March the 3rd, 1991. After a short 17-minute trip from Denver, United Airlines Flight 585 is on final approach into Colorado Springs. It looks like a perfect day for flying, but there's trouble in the air.
Nice looking day. Hard to believe the skies are unfriendly.
There's been heavy turbulence during the flight, and violent gusts of wind are forecast over Colorado Springs.
Never driven to Colorado Springs and not gotten sick?
At the controls is 52-year-old Captain Harold Green, a pilot with 20 years' experience and a sterling reputation. Green's co-pilot is Patricia Eidson. At 42, she's one of the first female flight officers in United's history.
Flight attendants, prepare for landing.
At Colorado Springs Municipal Airport, Air Traffic Controller James Rayfield is ready to bring Flight 585 in.
United 585, report the airport in sight.
Got it?
Yep.
Airport in sight, United 585.
Lower landing gear.
United 585 is cleared for a visual approach to runway 35. Weather conditions, wind 320 degrees at 16, gusting to 29.
As its speed decreases, Flight 585 becomes more vulnerable to the turbulence. Eidson wants to know what other planes have experienced on landing.
Any reports lately of any loss or gain of airspeed?
Yes, ma'am. 500 feet, a 50-knot loss. At 400 feet, a 50-knot gain. And at 150 feet, a gain of 20 knots.
Sounds adventurous, thank you.
Starting on down.
Less than 3 kilometers from the airport, retired policeman Harold Darnell is on his way to a local flea market. A kilometer overhead, Green and Eidson focus on keeping their speed constant as they descend.
Wait, a 10-knot change here.
Yeah, I know. Awful lot of power to hold that airspeed.
As United 585 approaches the runway, Darnell feels something strange.
Oh, what the heck was that?
Out of nowhere, a powerful gust of wind strikes his vehicle, almost blowing him off the road.
Another 10-knot gain.
3 flaps.
From the control tower, James Rayfield can now see Flight 585's final approach. As the aircraft closes in on the airport, the ride gets even bumpier.
Well, we're at 1,000 feet.
Then, without warning, the 737 starts to spin out of control.
Oh, God, slip! 15 flaps! 15! Going up. Oh, my God!
Oh my lord.
Crash! Crash!
Rescue workers arrive within minutes, but there's almost no sign of the 737. The shattered remains of the 38-ton jet lie buried in a fire-blackened impact crater.
The plane didn't skate or bounce, you know, like when a plane comes in normally and lands. It just nosed right in, and where it hits, where it stayed.
And I came down here, and this is when I saw all of the, it was horrible.
There are no survivors. All 20 passengers and 5 crew members are killed instantly by the high-speed impact and exploding jet fuel. In 10 violent seconds, Colorado Springs has become the site of one of the most mysterious air crashes in aviation history. By nightfall, investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board descend on Colorado Springs. Known to insiders as tin kickers, NTSB investigators examine over 2,000 aviation accidents a year, at times by picking through the metal debris of fallen aircraft. While coroners mark the location of human remains in red, NTSB investigators mark scraps of metal in yellow, looking for clues to help them solve the mystery of Flight 585. Like investigating a mass murder, it's a tough job walking onto a crash site. Among the investigators assigned to the case is Malcolm Brenner, a specialist in human performance. His job will be to find out if the crash was caused by pilot error.
The area was cordoned off by police, and there were Salvation Army trucks. I got a cup of coffee, a cup of hot chocolate or something, and I thanked them for it, and they said, "No, no, thank you." And they had this look in their eyes like, "My God, you have to go into this site."
Clues to the fate of United 585 lie mangled in a deep black hole. The fuselage is crushed like an accordion in the impact crater. The rest of the plane is in pieces spread over an area smaller than a football field.
There was a lot of fire damage. There'd been a fire afterwards, and it was all contained in a relatively small area, which just initial impression, it can be a sign that the airplane was intact. If there was a mid-air explosion or something came off the airplane, you'd expect that to be a much larger site.
My first sense that it was going to take some time to investigate the accident was the damage that we saw in the parts. When they're burnt and broken, the process always takes longer.
But with their work just beginning, members of the NTSB have no clue that the case of United 585 will become the longest crash investigation in aviation history. A clear late winter day in 1991 turned deadly in just 10 short seconds. Moments from landing in Colorado Springs, United Airlines Flight 585 fell out of the sky at 370 kilometers per hour.
Crash! Crash!
All 20 passengers and 5 crew members died. The National Transportation Safety Board begins a painstaking investigation into the crash. Engine turbines, hydraulic pressure gauges, the cockpit voice recorder and in-flight data recorder are all carefully extracted from the site, photographed and sent to the lab for analysis. An important first step in the investigation is the analysis of the cockpit voice recorder. With pilot error a factor in 70% of air disasters, Malcolm Brenner's job is to see what role pilots Green and Eidson played in the crash.
This crew was, and I felt this at the time, was one of the more impressive crews I'd ever dealt with. There was a little bit of tension release, a little bit of humor. The captain said,
"Never driven to Colorado Springs and not gotten sick?"
The first officer suggested that they add extra speed as a safety margin. The captain agreed with it. It was good interaction.
Got it?
Yep.
Airport in sight, United 585.
Lower landing gear.
This is a sense of an excellent crew, caught randomly, if anything. So again, that was my first impression, is that this would be consistent more with a hardware situation.
As more about Flight 585 becomes known, mechanical failure becomes a serious suspect. Just seconds before it crashed, the plane rolled onto its back and spun wildly out of control. Investigators wonder if the sudden motion was caused by the plane losing an engine or a wing. From the state of the aircraft on site, it's clear that it was intact at the time of the crash. What investigators don't know is if the engines were still working at impact. Technicians examined the engine turbines. They discover dirt has been drawn deeply into every crevice. These blades were clearly spinning and sucking in air at the time of impact. The engines may have been running, but technicians aren't sure how well. The plane's hydraulic pressure dials are destroyed, their glass covers broken. The indicator needles have been snapped off by the force of the impact, but even these ravaged dials tell a tale.
15 flaps! 15!
On close inspection, investigators find a critical mark. At the moment of impact, a dent was made on the faceplate by the jarred indicator needle. It proves that when United 585 crashed, its engines were running normally. With engine failure ruled out, there seems to be only one other mechanical explanation for why 585 suddenly rolled over and then fell out of the sky. It appears increasingly likely that the plane had suffered a catastrophic problem with its flight controls. Investigators quickly become suspicious of the rudder at the back of the tail.
We focused in after eliminating other flight control surfaces that we thought could contribute to the roll. We started looking at the rudder.
Bring that up so I can take a look at it.
Investigators begin their examination of the rudder on site, but the violence of the crash makes the job extremely difficult.
Almost nothing left.
Most of the plane's parts are too crushed or burned for testing, but a vital component is still reasonably intact. The Power Control Unit, or PCU. Used constantly during flight, especially during landings, the PCU performs like a car's power steering. When the pilot pushes on a rudder pedal, the PCU uses hydraulic fluid to convert gentle movements of a pilot's foot into the pressure needed to move the 737's enormous rudder. The heart of the PCU is something called the dual servo valve. Shaped like a soda can, it has two slides which glide past one another, directing the flow of pressurized hydraulic fluid that moves the rudder.
This servo valve is very unique, that it is, in effect, two valves in one, and that creates a whole range of interactions that don't occur in a more conventional hydraulic valve.
When a technician opens the power control unit, chips of metal are found floating in the hydraulic fluid. It's a disturbing find. These particles could cause the servo valve to jam, making it impossible to work the plane's rudder. It's a chilling prospect. Could a microscopic fault bring down a 38-ton jet? It's difficult for Phillips to tell. While more intact than much of the wreck, the PCU and dual servo valve are both damaged.
The airplane crashed and burnt in a pretty confined area, and there was a lot of damage to the flight control components and the things we were testing and needed to test and look at. The more damaged the components are, the harder it is to take measurements and do functional testing.
To test what he does have, Phillips travels to California, to the labs of Parker Hannifin, where the rudder control unit is made. The curious metal chips floating in the PCU's chambers are dismissed. Phillips is told that filters keep them out of the delicate servo valve that directs fluid and moves the rudder. Nothing else is found that could explain any sudden movement of the rudder on Flight 585.
We didn't have any absolute indication or information that we could point to that said the rudder power control unit, the servo valve, or any part of that flight control system caused that accident.
Phillips still suspects a mechanical problem, but with no conclusive evidence that the PCU or servo valve caused the crash, he's forced to sign off on the tests.
It's a pass.
With Phillips at a dead end, only bad mountain weather remains as a primary suspect. An expert on weather-related aviation accidents, Greg Salatolo is trying to determine if heavy winds on the day of the crash were a factor.
There is a history of events where there have been airplane accidents attributed to mountain waves or rotors. In 1966, a BOAC 707 near Mount Fuji disintegrated in a mountain wave and rotor.
High winds crashing over mountain peaks leave so-called wind rotors in the lee side. Invisible, highly turbulent downdrafts that come plunging down with devastating power and are extremely dangerous to aircraft.
We found a great deal of evidence looking at the surface upper air data and talking to witnesses in the area that rotors were a possibility.
An explosion, it was right over there.
Salatolo hears several eyewitness reports of bizarre mountain weather on the day of the crash. One of the most intriguing is from Harold Darnell.
Oh, what the heck was that?
Whose truck was struck by a powerful gust of wind just moments before 585 crashed. But as Greg Salatolo combs through his evidence, the theory that a wind rotor knocked the plane from the sky is getting less and less likely.
Nice looking day. Hard to believe the skies are unfriendly.
Wind rotors are areas of extremely low barometric pressure. So if Flight 585 did pass through one, its altimeter reading would have spiked as the plane was blown suddenly upwards.
There was no evidence that we saw that on the flight data recorder of 585.
What the flight recorder did show was a fast and deadly drop in altitude as the plane fell to Earth. It's been 21 months since the investigation into the crash of United Flight 585 began. Almost 2 years in which the NTSB has studied the crew, the weather, the rudder, and thousands of other pieces of evidence. They've come up empty-handed. For only the 4th time in its history, the NTSB releases a report which doesn't reach a conclusion. The cause of the crash of Flight 585 is undetermined.
We had put a lot of time and effort into the investigation, and we just weren't sure what had happened.
It was like he was tracking a serial killer. He was frustrated that they had not solved 585. He did not want that to happen again.
But almost 2 years after the report on 585 is released, the killer strikes again. At 7 p.m. on a clear, windless day, US Air Flight 427 is nearing Pittsburgh. Captain Peter Germano and First Officer Chuck Emmett are getting ready for their final approach.
Folks, from the flight deck, we should be on the ground about 10 more minutes. Sunny skies, a little hazy. Flight attendants, please prepare for landing. I ask you to check the security of your seatbelt. Thank you.
US Air 309, descend and maintain 6,000.
As they close in on the airport, the pilots are on the lookout for another flight about 10 kilometers ahead of them.
Looking for the traffic. Turning 100, US Air 427.
I see the jet stream.
As they pass through the turbulence left behind by the other flight, their jet suddenly and alarmingly rolls left.
Hold on, hold on. Hold on, shoot!
Nothing the pilots do seems to have any effect.
What the hell is this? What the? Go! Shoot! 427, emergency! Oh, shoot. Oh! Oh, God! Oh, God, no!
Rescue crews arrive quickly, but the fate of Flight 427 is tragically clear. There's no hope for the 132 passengers and crew. The human carnage is so bad, authorities declare the crash site a biohazard.
US Air 427 accident was the first US accident where biohazard suits were used, and it made it more difficult. They were uncomfortable, they were hot, and to this day, when I put on a pair of rubber gloves, for any reason, I'm instantly transformed back to the site in Pittsburgh.
Captain John Cox, a 737 pilot and a flight systems specialist with the Airline Pilots Association, is asked to join the team investigating the crash of Flight 427. As coroners attempt to collect human remains, NTSB lead investigator Tom Houter already knows his hunt for clues will be long and painstaking.
When we first arrived at the crash site, well, first of all, there was no aircraft there. There were only bits and pieces of the airplane. It wasn't really recognizable as an airplane.
With the help of eyewitnesses, information from the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder, investigators begin to quickly see some striking similarities between 427 and the unsolved case of United 585. In fact, they seem to be mirror images of each other. On final approach, United 585 rolls right, while US Air 427 rolls to the left.
Oh, God, flip! Hang on.
Both crews are caught by surprise, and after just a few terrifying seconds, both aircraft plummet straight into the ground.
Certainly the whole team was aware of the previous accident with United 585 in Colorado Springs. We try to keep that in the back of our minds and take a look at this one as to what it presents to us.
As the investigation continues, the list of similarities grows. 427's engines were also attached and functioning at the time of impact. But for all the similarities, there's one important difference. Unlike United 585, as US Air 427 approached Pittsburgh, weather conditions were dead calm.
Folks, from the flight deck, we should be on the ground about 10 more minutes. Sunny skies, a little hazy.
Taking a look at the flight data recorder information, the aircraft's approaching Pittsburgh. It's an extremely smooth night. There's just no turbulence at all. The pilots are relaxed. They're talking about the landing.
Flight attendants, please prepare for landing. Ask you to check the security of your seatbelts. Thank you.
As he did in the case of United 585, Greg Phillips will once again lead the investigation into the mechanical aspects of the crash. Almost immediately, he makes a promising discovery. Miraculously, much of US Air 427's tail and rudder appear intact. The hydraulic devices inside the tail have also sustained very little damage. Phillips and Houter prepare to send the parts to the manufacturer, Parker Hannifin, for testing as soon as possible. They need answers. Pressure on the NTSB to solve the accident is growing quickly. Not only are the crashes of flights 585 and 427 disturbingly similar, both of them involve the same kind of airplane, a Boeing 737. But with serious questions being raised about the plane's safety, billions of dollars, and perhaps the airline industry itself, are at risk.
We couldn't live with the fact as investigators of having two unsolved 737 accidents. The airplane is in too much use, too wide a use around the world. It carries too many people every day. Unsolved was not an acceptable answer.
If 427 was an undetermined accident, we could not find the cause of this accident, there was a great chance that if there was a third accident with the 737 fleet under similar circumstances, that the 737 fleet would have been grounded.
Careful with it.
The investigation into the crash of Flight 427 may be the most important in the history of the NTSB. But it won't be easy. Answers are still years away. In just 3 years, 2 Boeing 737s have crashed in the United States with no survivors.
Site United 585.
In both cases, the planes were moments from landing.
Flight attendants, please prepare for landing.
And in both cases, the planes were under full power, but the pilots were unable to control their jets. In the crash of United Flight 585, NTSB investigators were unable to find a cause. Now they're searching for clues into the second crash, US Air Flight 427.
As the investigator in charge, I never allowed myself to think this investigation could go undetermined. We kept on pushing and kept on researching. As long as we had things to research, we kept on going.
To find their killer, the NTSB can't afford to rule anything out. From the possibility that a collision with birds brought 427 down, to strange, even bizarre theories.
They looked at electromagnetic interference. They got calls from people saying it might be Russian death rays. They considered everything.
There were a couple of witnesses who gave reports of the aircraft suddenly descending and hovering before it blew up. We discounted those.
But the investigation's primary suspect is the dual servo valve, part of the power control unit that moves the 737's rudder, and a suspect in the crash of United 585. Parker Hannifin made the valve. At its lab in California, investigators look inside the main cavity of the US Air Power Control Unit. Just like in the earlier crash, they find tiny chips of metal floating in the hydraulic fluid. But once again, Parker and Boeing repeat their claim. Filters designed to stop any debris from interfering with the delicate metal slides have done their job. Investigator Greg Phillips wants to be absolutely sure. If the chips were blocking the slides, they would have left tiny scratch marks behind where they rubbed against the metal. But Phillips can't find any.
Another pass. Okay.
Phillips has technicians put the servo valve from Flight 427 through as many tests as he can think of, trying to find a weakness. If he can find one, it could explain why 2 planes were ripped from the sky. But he comes up empty.
That unit passed all its operational tests. There wasn't any indication that it had failed, and it operated within the parameters we expected it to.
Once again, the investigators are forced to shift their focus back to the pilots. By studying the plane's flight data recorder, investigators know that the jet's rudder was deployed fully to one side, what's called rudder hardover.
We were definitely focused on rudder, on hardover rudder, full rudder input for about 20 seconds. It can be caused either by hardware, something unknown in the hardware, or it can be caused by pilot input.
First Officer Chuck Emmett, who was flying 427, did indeed step down hard on his rudder and then held it there while the plane plummeted towards the Earth. It raised a grisly question. Was he trying to fly the plane into the ground?
And looking at this, and being a pilot myself, is like, this doesn't seem like rational behavior.
What the hell is this?
Human performance specialist Malcolm Brenner listens closely for evidence on the cockpit voice recorder.
What the hell? Shoot!
In this case, they had microphones right by their mouths, and you can hear as well as in real life or better. You can hear breathing sounds.
Yeah, I see the jet stream.
The cockpit recordings indicate that Flight 427's troubles began at the moment it flew through the jet wake of a Delta Airlines 727 that had just passed in front of them.
Both pilots are startled by the wake.
I see the jet stream.
The first officer breaks off at the end of a sentence. I see the jet stream, and there's no more discussion of the jet stream or anything else. They both focus. Something happened here. Captain says, "Sheesh."
It was such a smooth flight that it was a momentary jolt that they just hadn't anticipated. And with that, the pilots got on the controls and immediately, put in a rudder input.
The cockpit recorder even records the thumping sound of the jet stream turbulence as 427 flies through it. As Flight 427 encounters the turbulence, Brenner hears something unusual. First Officer Emmett begins to grunt.
The grunting is unusual. The controls are designed so that pilots don't need to grunt. They're specially designed around human capabilities. So to have someone grunting is typically a sign of an emergency.
By matching data from the flight recorder with the crew's voices, Brenner is able to confirm that Emmett's grunts begin a split second after he pushed down on the rudder pedal, and 3 to 4 seconds after the wake turbulence affected Flight 427.
What the hell?
On their own, the cockpit voice recordings prove very little. But it seems clear that the crew weren't trying to crash their plane. Something happened which took them by surprise. They reacted as quickly as they could, but nothing they did seemed to help.
What the hell is this?
It's been almost 2 years since the crash of Flight 427, and the investigation has stalled. Now 2 737s have gone down in startlingly similar ways, and investigators still don't know why.
We were all frustrated as months wore into years. What were we missing?
It definitely took a toll in their personal lives. They worked incredibly long hours. They never stopped thinking about it.
We were going up against an aircraft that had an incredible safety history. It was really everything you could see for 30 years. This has been a great airplane. We were trying to prove that there was something wrong with the straight A student.
It clearly was on his mind. He, at one point, had a nightmare about it where he dreamed that he was in front of a congressional committee that was grilling him on now there had been a third 737 crash, and in Tom's dream, all of the cameras were pointing to him, and a congressman asked, "Why didn't you ground the fleet?"
Unsure of where to look next, and with the trail of evidence getting colder, investigators need a break in the case, and fast.
East Wing 517, you're clear for landing.
On June the 9th, 1996, they finally get the break they've been looking for. Captain Brian Bishop is on final approach to Richmond, Virginia, when, without warning, his east wind jet rolls sharply to the right.
We didn't know to what extent, but we knew we had a problem with the rudder. I turned the yoke the opposite direction and stood on the opposite rudder pedal. But the pedal didn't move for me.
For over 30 seconds, the 737 flies in a precarious right bank as Bishop fights to keep it from rolling over. Then suddenly, the unknown forces holding the jet let go, snapping the wings back to horizontal.
In a matter of seconds, it released itself and went back to normal. We had started the checklist. Almost before I could finish the sentence, all of a sudden there was just a wham.
For a second time, the 737 is pushed onto its side. For 30 harrowing seconds, the 737 takes on a life of its own. Then, once again, as quickly as it began, the rollover stops.
After the second time, I looked at the first officer and I said, "Declare an emergency."
Tell the controller we have flight control problems.
As they slow down to land, the risks increase. If a third rollover occurs, they won't have enough airspeed to recover.
I did at some point tell my first officer to look out the window and find a dark spot. It was nighttime and we were looking to avoid a neighborhood or a populated area. And he very calmly responded that, "Hey, here's a spot over here."
But there is no third rollover. Bishop brings Flight 517 in high and fast and lands safely.
Taxiing in is when I realized my legs were shaking. We got the aircraft to the gate, and I did pick up the PA to make an announcement to try to explain what had just happened to these people. And on picking up their microphone, I realized there was nothing I could say to make this any better. And probably for the first time in a long time, I was at a loss of words. So I simply put the microphone down and let it go at that.
But Bishop won't remain speechless for long. By the next day, the investigation team has arrived in Richmond.
Flight data recorded it was undamaged, an airplane undamaged. We launched to the scene. The airplane literally didn't move, stayed at its location in the airport until we got down there.
There were a lot of FAA, a lot of NTSB, and they all wanted to talk to us very badly.
It gave the NTSB a tremendous break because suddenly they had a 737 that had had a rudder incident that was intact, and they had a pilot who was alive and who could talk about it.
I think they were much happier to have the airplane than me. I think the airplane probably gave them more to research than I ever could.
NTSB investigators quickly determined that what happened on board Eastwind Flight 517 is alarmingly similar to events on Flights 427 and 585. If they can discover why Bishop's 737 rolled over, they may be able to crack 2 mysterious and fatal accidents.
And when we said, well, what happened? They said, there was something wrong with the rudder pedal. The pedal wouldn't go down. I was standing on the rudder pedal and I couldn't get it to go down. My God.
With Bishop's first-person testimony, investigators immediately zero in on Eastwind's rudder controls. The power control unit is removed, inspected, and then tested again and again. To the frustration of everyone, the unit performs perfectly.
We tested that aircraft as is. It was intact. We went through it completely. We did flight tests with it, and it passed all tests.
After a 5-year hunt for clues, a third mysterious rudder event on a 737, and a live pilot as a witness, Tom Houter still lacks the evidence he needs to crack his case. He decides to push his chief suspect, Flight 427's rudder controls, a little harder.
One fellow mentioned a test they had done in the military of a thermal shock, where if you had the actuator being very cold and put in very hot hydraulic fluid, it would cause it to react in strange ways. So we put together a thermal shock test, and this test was extreme to say the least.
On August the 26th, 1996, in Valencia, California, NTSB investigators gather to watch the torture test of US Air 427's PCU. After soaking it in dry ice, the PCU is blasted with nitrogen gas to simulate the -40-degree temperatures at 10,000 meters. Then it's quickly injected with superheated hydraulic fluid and given the command to start working.
As we were standing there listening to the actuator move left and right, it stopped. And it was not commanded to stop.
It just jammed. Stopped working completely. Take a look.
Systems investigator Greg Phillips now asks that the valve be taken apart and scanned for scratches. They find none.
Look at that. Doesn't leave a trace.
It's a crucial breakthrough to solving an almost perfect crime. Not only have they proven that the valve which controls the rudders can jam, no evidence is left behind. Tom Houter and his team have now found that a small hydraulic valve that controls the rudder of the world's most popular commercial jetliner can jam in the right circumstances. It's an ominous discovery, but incredibly, there's another shocking surprise in store for the investigators. October the 15th, 1996. For the last 5 years, the National Transportation Safety Board has been struggling to crack its toughest case. 2 completely separate, but seemingly linked accidents. The crash of United 585 killed 25 passengers and crew. 3 years later, the US Air Flight 427 disaster took another 132 lives. Now, after examining hundreds of clues, investigators have made a surprising discovery. A new test has revealed that under the right circumstances, the hydraulic valve that moves the 737's rudder can jam.
It just jammed.
But the surprises aren't over.
The most important breakthrough came when a Boeing engineer, examining the data from that test, discovered some numbers that indicated the valve at that point had actually reversed.
Whoa.
It's a stunning revelation. Not only can the servo valve jam, but it can then function in reverse. It means that any time a pilot tries to correct a rollover by pushing on the rudder might turn in the opposite direction, causing a fatal accident.
And the reversal is like driving your car. You turn to the right, it goes left. You're not going to figure out this failure mode until you go off the road. And in these cases, that's the pilots were faced with, something so unusual that they didn't understand what was happening.
What the hell is this?
They had evidence now that the valve was unique, that the valve not only could jam, but would reverse.
427, emergency!
That would explain why the first officer, Chuck Emmett, would keep his foot on the rudder pedal, because he's thinking, why isn't the plane going right? And he's feeling the plane go to the left.
To the very end, Chuck Emmett pushes hard, hoping his rudder will help him pull out of his deadly spiral. Tragically, he has no way of knowing that he's steering the aircraft straight into the ground.
Ever driven to Colorado Springs and not gotten sick?
Flight attendants prepare for landing.
Satisfied that they've determined the cause of the crash of US Air 427, the NTSB turns its attention to the unsolved case of United 585.
Another 10-out game.
Going back to Colorado Springs, you could follow a progression of what the captain was doing. He's close to the ground, and suddenly, under rudder reversal, he puts in a little bit of pedal. The pedal violently pushes his leg back.
Oh, God! Slip!
15 flap!
15!
Rudder reversal certainly fits what I know about this crew and how it fits.
We were able to show the failure mode. It matched the flight data recorder from each aircraft. It fit like a glove. So we now had a lot more information we could apply to United 585. And based on that, we redid the accident report.
Oh my God!
From rudder reversal to impact took less than 10 seconds. 585's flight crew had no chance to save their plane or passengers. In the aftermath of the investigation, sweeping changes were made to improve the safety of the 737 and the entire aviation industry. New training protocols were designed to help pilots react to unusual in-flight events. In the 737 fleet, pilots are now trained on how to react to both rudder hardovers and reversals.
The scenario of the US Air 427 accident, if the crew had the information that we have today, I believe they would have landed safely in Pittsburgh that evening.
The FAA also directed Boeing to redesign the rudder's dual servo valve to eliminate the potential for reversal. Boeing spent hundreds of millions of dollars to replace the valves on thousands of 737s around the world.
One thing we don't like at the safety board is to have an undetermined accident, because then we can't make a change to improve safety. So out of US Air 427, United 585, we have a much safer 737 fleet.
It took NTSB tin kickers 10 years to solve the mysterious crashes of flights 585 and 427, the longest investigation in aviation history.
There are still some people in aviation who don't think the NTSB got it right. But I became convinced after talking to many people, pilots, engineers, people at Boeing, and spending a lot of time with the investigators, that they did get it right.
Since the replacement of the 737 servo valves, there hasn't been a similar crash of the most popular, most profitable plane in the world. In heavy wind and blinding rain, the crew of a passenger jet struggles to land.
Put it down! Put it down!
A terrifying crash landing leads to a desperate fight to survive.
The only thing that matters to me now is to get my daughter Emily and protect her as we blow up.
But we just knew that there were so many passengers in that plane that had not gotten out.
Open the door! Open the door!
This is a true story based on air traffic control recordings, official reports, and interviews with those involved. Tuesday, August the 2nd, 2005. Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris. 297 passengers are boarding Air France Flight 358, bound for Toronto.
Far aisle, left-hand side. Merci.
Philippe Lacaille is traveling with his wife and 2 of his 4 children. They're stuck at the back of the enormous jet, and they're not sitting together.
It just happened that we were separated from Emily. They had 3 seats together, so we were in the middle section, and Emily was actually sitting a couple of seats ahead of us on the right side, so close to the right wing of the plane.
For Eddie Ho, Flight 358 is the continuation of a trip that began in Johannesburg.
I'm an international student in Canada at Queen's University, and every summer I go back to South Africa.
Ho isn't traveling light.
I was carrying everything that I had, my books to my clothing to tuition money for the year, computer laptops.
This is also another leg in a long journey for Joanne Cordery Bundock, who's returning from a trip to Thailand.
I rerouted myself in the last 2 days before the flight from Bangkok through Paris to come directly to Toronto.
As the passengers continue to board, the flight crew gets settled into the Airbus A340. The captain is 57-year-old Alain Rosaille. He's been with Air France for more than 20 years. His co-pilot is 43-year-old Frédéric No.
Do you want to start, or should I?
Why don't you fly first, and then I'll take over for landing in Toronto. I check the weather.
On this flight, the 2 men decide that Captain Rosaille will handle the takeoff in Paris, and co-pilot No will land in Toronto.
Destination, Toronto Pearson.
Check. Crews often split the duties so that co-pilots can get more experience. Rosaille and No are joined by one other person in the cockpit.
I think you've been expecting me. I'm Miles Trouchesset.
Welcome. Miles Trouchesset is the son of an Air France employee. He's allowed to ride in the cockpit's jump seat for free.
I just want to let you know I've done this before. I promise I'll be quiet.
This Air France plane is one of the safest in the world. Since the A340s first went into service in 1993, they've had an excellent safety record.
Air France 358. Air France 358, runway 27 left. Cleared for takeoff.
Cleared for takeoff. Air France 358. Have a good afternoon, gentlemen.
Just a few minutes before 2 in the afternoon, Flight 358 powers into the sky above Paris. Toronto may be several thousand kilometers away, but the friends and family of those on board Flight 358 are already making plans to meet the plane when it arrives.
Hello? Audrey, I won't forget. I'll make sure to pick up Mom and Dad. No, I won't forget the 2 brats either. I'll get them all.
Well, we usually make arrangements before we go to France to be picked up. It's easier because we have lots of luggage, you know, and we bring back stuff from France. So it just happened that Julian, our son, was going to spend the summer in Toronto and was available to pick us up.
Sis, I'll give you a call as soon as I get in. Don't worry. I got it covered. Okay? All right. Talk to you soon. Bye.
Center, we have a humidex advisory and extreme heat alert for Toronto, as well as a thunderstorm warning in effect for Toronto.
A regular flight from Paris to Toronto takes about 8 hours. As Air France 358 closes in on Canada, there's little to separate this trip from any other.
I found that their service was amazing. The food was great. They had very good flight attendants.
There were a lot of exchange students from France, you know, like teenagers, you know, coming to Canada for their first time, usually their first flight, and they were very rowdy.
There was a beautiful day on the flight over, and the sun was shining, and it was just blue skies and white clouds and just a lovely day.
The autopilot does most of the work for Captain Alain Rouzaille and his co-pilot Frédéric No. Just as the two men had planned, No is now in control of the plane.
We have a new weather report.
The two men get regular updates on the weather conditions in Toronto.
Overcast and rainy with a chance of thunderstorms. Temperature in the low 20s.
At Toronto's International Airport, the thunderstorms are already rolling through. Rain, wind, and lightning are hammering the runways. The lightning has already forced airport authorities to declare a red alert. It means that the chance of being struck by lightning is so great that ground crews are not allowed to work on the planes. Just as Flight 358 closes in on Toronto, it's put into a holding pattern. The weather isn't getting any better.
There's going to be a little delay.
Air France 358, so Roger on delay.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. I'm sorry to inform you that there'll be a short delay. There's some weather conditions above Toronto, and we're just going to give it a couple of minutes to clear up.
I was very surprised when I heard the captain's announcement that we were going to be delayed in landing for about 25 or 30 minutes because of thunderstorms over Toronto.
While they're not in the storm yet, the crew enters their holding pattern northeast of Toronto. Their alternate airport is almost 300 kilometers away in Ottawa. At the moment, the plane has a little over 7,500 kilograms of fuel in its tanks, more than enough to get them there.
Typically, a pilot will think about the economic impact of diverting to an alternate airport. While that is not a primary decision maker, it is an alternate decision maker as far as if they have to divert, how are the folks going to be transported from that alternate airport back to the destination airport that the airplane was originally going to.
Flying almost 300 passengers to Ottawa would be a logistical nightmare. But the crew can't circle for too long with the fuel they have. If the delay continues, they'll have no choice but to divert.
Air France, Toronto arrival. Your hold is now canceled. You are cleared for a WASI 2 arrival. Maintain 5,000 feet.
Air France 358, Roger on cancellation of hold. Cleared for WASI 2 arrival and maintain.
Today, the delay isn't long at all. Although the storm continues to thunder down near the airport, the crew is put into their landing sequence.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Just wanted to let you know we're beginning our descent into Toronto at this time. We should be on the ground at about 4 p.m. local time.
Usually when they say 45 minutes, you know, it's to be nice. You know, usually it's like an hour and a half. This time it was like 20 minutes. 20 minutes later, they said, okay, well, now we're going to go down, prepare, for the landing.
With co-pilot Frédéric No at the controls, the plane begins its descent into the storm.
Air France 358, reducing speed to 190.
No isn't prepared for what he's about to face. The storm has a savage surprise in store for everyone on board Flight 358. A brutal summer storm is battering Toronto. Winds and lightning are hammering the airport, making it tense for incoming planes. After a short hold, Air France Flight 358, with 297 passengers aboard, begins descending into the storm.
Flaps 2.
Flaps 2. F-speed.
Gear down.
Landing gear down. Spoilers armed. 4 green.
Landing gear down. Spoilers armed. 4 green.
You'll be fine. Don't worry. It immediately turned into very dark skies and dark clouds and a little bit bumpy and choppy, and the weather outside was definitely within a thunderstorm. But really and truly, to me, it was just a typical stormy landing. Nothing out of the ordinary.
In the main cabin, though, not everyone is so sure.
The plane was getting very bumpy. There was a lot of turbulence. We were surrounded basically by heavier weather, and this was completely not expected. I didn't expect that.
Air France 358, slow your final approach speed.
Air France 358.
Co-pilot Frédéric No has the plane in position. He's moments from landing.
Air France 358, roger.
Flaps to full.
Flaps full.
It was going darker and darker. We were like in the middle of hundreds and hundreds of lightnings. Like every second we had lightnings all around us. So people were getting nervous, quite nervous. I was getting nervous.
Ahead of the Air France Airbus, 2 other planes have just touched down on the same runway that Flight 358 is heading for.
Air France 358, this is Toronto Tower.
Toronto Tower, Air France 358, go ahead.
You are cleared to land runway 24 left. Be advised the preceding aircraft reports braking action is poor, and they estimate the surface winds near the runway as 290 degrees at 15 to 20 knots.
Braking poor, 15 knots, gust to 20. France 358, thank you.
The crew is being sent to runway 24 left, which will allow them to land into the wind. It also happens to be the closest runway to the city's biggest freeway, which is gearing up to handle the evening rush hour traffic. Facing unpredictable winds and a wet runway, the crew prepare for the landing.
Select auto brakes to medium.
Medium is set.
The final approach for landing was hellish. Lightnings were all over. Turbulences were enormous. You could feel the pilot fight with the plane to keep the plane in line with the runway to land, and they had a heck of a time to keep it lined up. I know my son next to me was getting very nervous, and I was nervous to see my daughter actually far from us.
I cinched up my seatbelt tighter than it was, expecting a very hard landing, and the pilot was going to stick it on the runway, or we were maybe going to do a touch and go, and he was going to give it power and go around, because I knew that it was not going to be just a normal landing.
Landing. Autopilot, auto thrust off.
At 2 minutes after 4 o'clock, Air France Flight 358 roars over the beginning of the runway.
Put it down! Put it down!
This landing was more intense and harder than any time I've ever landed in another aircraft.
It's a very difficult landing, and everyone started clapping, and even the lady who sitting next to me, I remember very clearly, she said, you know, wow, that was an amazing landing. And as soon as she finished that sentence, then all hell broke loose.
We started the plane started violently going up and down, and it felt like we were going 100 miles an hour down a road filled with potholes that were about 3 feet deep.
Immediately you could see this orange aura, and for me it's a picture I will never forget. My daughter was sitting ahead of us on the right side of the plane, and at that time she turned her head towards us, you know, with very wide eyes, you know, looking at us, and her face was surrounded by this enormous aura, orange aura of fire.
Then, moments after touching down, still traveling at 146 kilometers per hour, Flight 358 runs out of room.
At that point that I believed that we were all going to die. It was obvious that no one can survive this kind of thing.
I thought this was it.
The next thing that I can remember is that an announcement came. Ladies and gentlemen, everything's okay. We've stopped now. Well, no kidding. Of course we've stopped now. But I could tell that everything was not okay because I could immediately smell jet fuel.
As the smell of jet fuel fills the cabin, panic quickly spreads.
Everybody was expecting the plane to blow up. It was obvious.
Smoke and flames are spreading quickly. Now it's a desperate struggle to escape.
You hear shouting from the back that there was a fire, and then people started really getting panicked.
If they don't get out, they have just seconds to live.
We know that about 2 minutes into a fire, in many cases, the environment becomes untenable. So 90 seconds is a good rule that we use in trying to get people out to make sure that they have as much time and safety as possible.
297 passengers are desperate to leave the plane.
The only thing that matters to me now is to get my daughter Emily, who's sitting like 2 seats ahead of me, get her onto me, and protect her as we blow up.
Am I going to try to get my luggage, my laptop? And then I thought to myself, what if I would die trying to get my laptop? I just said, okay, I've got to get out. I've got to get out.
Flight 358 has 8 possible emergency exits, but seconds after the crash, most of them aren't opened.
people were crawling over the seats, they were pushing each other, they was basically all for yourself.
Hey, stay calm, please. Please stay calm. Be all right.
Open the door! Open the door!
And I could see the air attendant there struggling with the fact that should I or should I not open this door, because the fire was raging just in front of it.
If the fuel tanks rupture and we have a lot of fuel that gets out either onto the ground, well then there's enough heat and fire there that would cause the airplane skin to melt in a couple minutes.
At the front of the plane, thick smoke is pouring in through one of the open doors. Joanne Cordery-Bundock races to the other side of the plane.
The gentleman in front of me had his bag with him, and he was kind of fumbling around with that and trying to take that down the slide. He was a rather large man, and the slide did not deploy the entire way, so I kind of bailed off the side above him and hit the ground.
Eddie Ho has found an exit too, but there's no slide.
And people pushing me forward, I couldn't even control myself. And I was like, I don't want to jump as well because, it was 5 meters down at least.
Is he okay? Is he okay?
In the cockpit, Captain Rosai has been badly injured when his seat was ripped off the floor by the force of the crash. As precious seconds tick by, the flight attendant near the Lacais manages to open the exit door. Even though passengers are confronted with the flames and smoke of the burning engine, they jump out of the plane.
So push them down, my wife went down, I went down. We just ran up as fast as we could through torn metal and thorns and through whatever was left of the ground where the plane was.
Once the fire gets inside the airplane, all of the furnishings are much like the furnishings in your house, and there are foams and materials that, when they catch on fire, produce toxic gases, and that's really the most important lethal aspect of the fire.
Basically, you just had to jump. So what I did was, I prayed quickly and I closed my eyes and jumped.
Emergency workers are able to reach the burning jet just 52 seconds after it crashes. But with the threat of an explosion, it's dangerous to get too close.
It was very difficult to see anything due to the rain that was coming down. There was a lot of smoke engulfing the plane, some fire that was still ongoing, as well as you could see that some of the parts of the plane had broken off, some of the wheels that were at the side of the roadway, as well as portions of the plane's wings that had broken off.
Philippe Lacaille and his family struggle up the hill the plane has just plowed down.
And at that point, the plane blew up. Once, twice, 3 times. So you could feel and hear this enormous explosion actually taking place. On the first one, I looked at the first one because I just couldn't believe my eyes. I could see, I think, pieces of luggage, things flying up in the air. And of course, at that time, I figured, oh my God, that could have been us.
We had a perfect view of the airplane and see this black smoke coming out the side of the airplane, and the yellow and the orange and the red flames shooting out. We were fine, but we just knew that there were so many passengers in that plane that had not gotten out.
August the 2nd, 2005. Air France Flight 358 has crashed off its runway in Toronto. Flames are tearing at the fuselage. Smoke is pouring from the ruined jet. Dazed passengers are stumbling from the plane.
Passengers that were coming up, again, were very rain-soaked and muddy from coming up the hill. There were several individuals that once they got up there were crying and a bit emotional, as well as looking around for other passengers or family or friends that may have been with them at the time.
About 35 minutes ago, a plane ran off the runway at Toronto's Pearson Airport.
Footage of the crash quickly appears on local TV stations. Philippe Lacaille's daughter Audrey is one of the many people shocked by the pictures.
She turned on her TV, and here we go. There was the Air France crash right here, live in front of her, you know, burning, exploding right in front of her eyes.
250 people on board. We have not had any reason to make a statement yet as to whether anybody has survived or escaped.
Philippe Lacaille's son Julien is waiting for his father at the airport. He has no idea what's just happened to the Air France flight.
What? What do you mean, where am I? I'm at the airport waiting for mom and dad. Like, you... What?
So Julien didn't know anything, and he was there at the airport. And she says, well, you know what? I think you're going to have to wait a long time because the airplane just crashed.
One of the busiest highways in North America borders the airport. Just before rush hour, it's packed with thousands of vehicles. Drivers slow down, captivated by the terrifying sight of the burning plane. Some of the passengers who've escaped the plane stumble, dazed and shaken, right onto the edge of the highway. Passing motorists stop to take them to the airport.
At this point, there was only about 25 or 30 people with me in the airport. And here, you're also beginning to think, is this all there is?
As people are brought in, airport employees struggle to account for all the passengers and crew.
They were totally disorganized. There's no announcements being made. There's nothing of any kind of organization, and you're in this little crowded area with all the irate passengers waiting to be processed. Some people even said, you know, the first disaster was the plane crash, and the second disaster is exactly how it was handled afterwards.
Relatives wait desperately for any news. Julien Lacaille is just one of many who fears the worst.
For at least an hour and a half, he thought we were dead. That's a shame because, of course, we panicked. We were scared to death. But the families that were waiting for the passengers, they were even more scared because it lasted much longer. They really believed deep down that their family members were dead.
Finally, hours after the crash, passengers who have waiting family members are reunited.
Julian! Julian! Oh, you okay? You're okay. How did you...
We finally met up with Julian. It was 11 o'clock at night. It was, you know, God, we're so lucky. We're so lucky. We're alive, you know. It's hard to explain, but it's like you're giving a second chance, you know. Here's my son, you know. Maybe I didn't tell him I loved him, you know, when I left for France. Now it's time to say it right away. It was a very nice moment. A very, very deep moment.
It's just one of dozens of reunions. It takes hours to confirm, but by early evening, Air France and the local airport authorities can make the incredible announcement. Remarkably, every single passenger and all the members of the crew of Flight 358 have managed to escape the burning wreckage of their plane. The next day, smoke and charred wreckage are all that remain of Air France Flight 358. The Airbus A340 is a sophisticated, highly engineered plane with a glowing safety record. What had gone so terribly wrong? Canada's Transportation Safety Board quickly begins investigating the accident.
Landing. Autopilot auto thrust off.
Rain and lightning had been battling the airport all afternoon. Was it simply bad weather that caused this crash?
Put it down! Put it down!
Neither the pilot nor the co-pilot have spoken publicly about the crash.
We have to evacuate now!
Citing lawsuits that were filed soon after, Air France has kept all of its employees who were on the plane from speaking to the media.
Is he okay? I don't know. Is he okay? I don't know.
But former Air France trainer Hervé Labarthe has spoken to Captain Rosaille.
We spoke, let me think, for half an hour. He told me that this is the crucial point, that he has control. More specifically, informed control that he had reached the point where he would have to consider diverting. What he told me is that control informed him that they would soon open the runway. There was, of course, a lot of lightning, rain, and turbulence. And turbulence can have a devastating effect. Instruments become more difficult to read, the aircraft is harder to handle.
Investigators discover that as the crew struggled for control in the cockpit, on the ground, delicate instruments used to measure the wind at the runway were destroyed by lightning. With the ground equipment destroyed, they were relying on their onboard systems for information about wind conditions.
The onboard equipment only gives them the actual wind direction and speed on the nose of the aircraft at that exact time. It does not predict ahead of the aircraft. So the pilots really have no way of knowing what lies ahead of them.
But two planes had touched down just minutes before the Air France flight on the same runway. The crews of those planes did their best to inform air traffic control of the tricky conditions.
Air France 358, this is Toronto Tower.
Toronto Tower, Air France 358, go ahead.
You are cleared to land runway 24 left. Be advised, preceding aircraft reports braking action is poor, and they estimate the surface winds near the runway as 290 degrees at 15 to 20 knots.
Braking poor, 15 knots.
20-knot winds are strong, but are well within the allowable range for landing an A340. But when investigators study radar images of the airport, they discover quite a different story. As Flight 358 landed, a sharp line of rain moved across the runway from north to south. It was driven by a sudden gust of wind of up to 33 knots. The crew of the Air France jet had to deal with conditions that were much worse than they were expecting.
Landing. Autopilot auto thrust off.
33 knots is the demonstrated maximum crosswind for an A340, and that would be on a dry runway. So when you say 33 knots at 90 degrees, you're encroaching on the limits of the aircraft.
Closely studying the airport, investigators uncover another piece of the puzzle. Maintenance issues and the storm itself were forcing air traffic controllers to use runway 24 left for landings. It's the shortest runway at the airport, almost 650 meters shorter than some of the others. Blinded by rain, driven by unexpected winds, and landing on the shortest runway at the airport, Flight 358 was in a dangerous position.
Over the previous 4 hours, they had been made aware of the terrible storms and red alerts. And that was for me my biggest concern. Were they perhaps overtired? Were they lax, victims of routine? In any case, it's obvious that they hadn't gauged the extent of the danger.
It's evident that the flight crew didn't perceive the information that they were getting from these various sources as being threatening. Therefore, they attempted to make a landing.
But even in bad conditions, even on a short runway, the crew had 3,000 meters in which to land their plane. It should have been enough. To find out why it wasn't, investigators turned to the past. In 1999, an eerily similar accident took place in Little Rock, Arkansas.
Damn, we're off course. I can't see it. Way off.
Struggling with unpredictable weather, the crew of an American Airlines jet landed their plane, only to have it skid off the runway. 11 people were killed. Greg Feith helped investigate that crash.
One of the first things that I thought about was déjà vu. Having the first bits of information about the Air France accident, it reminded me so much of the American Airlines accident.
In the Little Rock crash, Feith discovered that the crew had made a critical mistake, which contributed significantly to the accident.
They hadn't followed all of the checklist procedures, and they didn't have the ground spoilers armed, which basically degrades the efficiency of lift on the wing and settles the airplane heavily on the main wheel so that braking action is more effective.
Spoilers are only one of several ways pilots of passenger jets stop their massive planes. Reverse thrusters are used to redirect the engine power forward as the plane lands, and sophisticated brakes help slow the jets down. To rule out any mechanical fault, all three systems are examined by investigators of the Air France crash. One of the brakes on Flight 358 was destroyed in the fire, but the 7 other sets of brakes are all tested after the accident. All of them are working properly.
Flaps 2, flaps 2, F-speed.
Investigators in Toronto also discover that, unlike in the Little Rock crash, this time the spoilers had deployed properly.
Landing gear down, spoilers armed, 4 green.
And when the engines are examined, the reverse thrusters are deployed. No obvious mechanical fault can be found. As the investigation continues, a French newspaper prints a bombshell. Le Figaro publishes a story claiming that the thrust reversers, which use the jet's engines to slow it down, were not turned on until the plane had been on the runway for more than 12 seconds.
As for Captain Rosay, he confirmed the newspaper report. His explanation was that his co-pilot had tensed up and was having difficulty controlling the lateral movement of the plane. No doubt because of the strong crosswinds and because the runway was so slippery, his hand was clamped tightly on the throttle release lever, which prevented the captain from reaching it himself. So the reverse thrusters could not be activated.
Shortly after the newspaper story appears, investigators publish their initial report. It confirms Le Figaro's version of events. Canada's Transportation Safety Board reveals that while the thrusters were found in the on position at the crash site, they had not been deployed as soon as the plane landed. In fact, it took 17 seconds before they reached maximum power.
The delay was a question raised in the report, and I wouldn't want to hazard a guess as to why there was such a delay or what was the cause of it. I just know that pilots, as a rule, want to get those reversers in as quickly as possible for maximum stopping.
The investigators reveal other confusing facts about the last few seconds of Flight 358. When it came over the start of the runway, it was twice as high as it should have been. And when it did land, it was nearly halfway down the runway.
Put it down! Put it down!
In these stormy conditions, the crew didn't have enough time to stop.
Once they found that the airplane had floated down the runway, the pilot has to make the decision whether we stay on the ground and try to salvage this bad situation, or we abort the landing, power up, pull up, and go around, get our stuff together, and then come back for a second landing.
Air France 358.
But decisions in a cockpit are joint decisions. The captain and the first officer work together.
If the captain sees that landing will be difficult, he must open throttle and go through abort landing procedures. That's his duty. And of course, the co-pilot is also allowed to be the first to act. But the captain's duty is to avoid at all costs a lengthy touchdown. That is clear.
Pour ne pas laisser se dérouler un atterrissage trop long, ça c'est clair.
By the time the plane touched down, it had only 1,500 meters to stop. And when it did land, critical seconds were lost when the reverse thrusters weren't engaged.
Est-ce que l'action des reverses immédiate
Would it have made a difference to immediately activate the reverse thrusters? Of course it would. Since reverse function reaches its peak efficiency at high speed, that is the exact moment of touchdown, that's what reverse is there for. It's all a matter of aerodynamic braking. The other problem is that the wheels touched ground in the middle of the runway, and reverse or no reverse, at that point it was already too late, as was pointed out by the head of the inquiry. That being said, if the reverse thrusters had been activated immediately, the plane would have come to a stop more quickly.
Il serait sorti moins et moins vite.
In heavy storms, the margin for error is razor thin. On this rain-filled afternoon, sudden wind, a long landing, and a short runway sealed the fate of everyone on board Flight 358. What concerns some in the aviation industry isn't this particular flight, but the reality that overruns are far too common. They happen all around the world. And safety procedures that could stop them are not in place. In August 2005, Air France Flight 358 crashed off the end of a runway in Toronto. It was a horrifying incident, yet amazingly everyone survived. But Flight 358 wasn't the only jet to go off the end of a runway in 2005. Worldwide, there were 37 other runway overruns. And the causes of all these accidents were remarkably similar.
There are a number of causal factors that occur again and again in runway overrun accidents. The weather conditions, the state of the runway surface. It can be wet, it can be icy, it can have snow on it. Speed in excess of a normal approach speed for the aircraft that does not then bleed off as the aircraft attempts to land. And these factors occur again and again in runway overrun accidents.
Unlike the crash at Toronto, some overruns are deadly. This Southwest Airlines flight in Chicago slid off its runway several months after the Air France crash. A small child was killed in a car that was driving on the nearby highway.
Many older airports, in particular in big cities which have expanded out towards the airport in the course of their growth, are constrained in the area that they can use for overruns.
You have to consider what happens when the runway is contaminated. Snow, ice, standing water. That will degrade the stopping performance of the airplane. Add to that a tailwind component, which was existent at the time that Air France landed. That, in combination with the contaminated runway, can jeopardize the landing performance and in fact increase it probably by 50%. The International Civil Aviation Organization recommends that every airport have a 300-meter safety zone at the end of runways that handle international flights. Canadian standards are a little less strict. They call for a 60-meter overrun area and recommend another 90 meters on top of that. Runway 24 left meets the low end of those recommendations.
There was another runway overrun accident to the runway in Toronto, which was very closely aligned with the runway that is there at the moment, in 1978, when a DC-9, an Air Canada DC-9, rejected a takeoff and ran into the ravine.
Well, the plane started to brake, and then there was just nothing, and then we dropped over the edge. There was about a 50-foot drop, I guess, at the end of the runway. We just went over the top, and then there was a heck of a bang, and people and seats all over the place.
2 people died in the 1978 accident. A coroner's inquest after the crash recommended that the gully be filled in, but it never was.
It's a steep ravine. It has about a 50-foot drop-off, and when you take a large, complicated and fragile piece of machinery like a commercial aircraft and you drop it 50 feet, then it tends to break.
There is a possible solution to runway overruns. but it's not being used in Toronto or many other international airports. It's called EMAS, or Engineered Material Arresting Systems.
It's a form of artificial stone or artificial gravel, which has a certain depth. And anybody who's ridden a bicycle into a gravel pit knows that a bicycle stops very quickly and it can be almost impossible to pedal it out. And the same thing happens to airplanes.
Several airports in the US use the system, but most international airports do not.
It's very much more effective than friction braking, and it's certainly incomparably more effective than thrust reverse and spoilers. And any one of these systems, when properly engineered, can stop a large airplane, no matter what the runway surface conditions, in a very short distance.
We have to evacuate now!
But one vital air safety guideline was met when Flight 358 crashed. In spite of the smoke and the spreading fire, the crew of the crippled plane made sure that all the passengers escaped in just 90 seconds.
It's just a miracle that all of those people were able to evacuate the airplane as quickly as they did before the airplane was consumed.
The Air France flight was particularly noteworthy in that everybody got out essentially unscathed. I know there were some injuries, but everyone got out. So I think it was noteworthy, and it was very good evacuation from that perspective.
Captain Alain Rosaille may never fly for Air France again. His injuries required extensive physical therapy after the crash. At the time, he was less than 3 years from retirement.
Every morning, Captain Rosaille relives the experience, coming face to face with the flames, the noise, the crash. And it made him sad to end his career on that note, having destroyed his plane. That's the worst possible fate for a pilot, the worst outcome.
The co-pilot, Frédéric No, is suspended for 3 months after the accident. By early the next year, he's back on duty with Air France. There are reports that after he helped Captain Rosaille out of the cockpit, he was the last person off the plane. The passengers deal with the crash in their own ways.
Well, I went through nightmares almost every single night, flashbacks during the day. Couldn't sleep, I couldn't eat. I questioned myself, why am I here? It's frightening, to be in such a state. And it has taught me to be strong.
We really need to take seriously those safety commands and evacuation information, because you never know. It was a perfect flight. There's not any indications that anything can go wrong, and it's right at the very last second that everything happens. So thank goodness I'm here to be able to talk about it now.
Open the door! Open the door!
There's a lot of negative in the accident, and there's a lot of positive. The negative is, oh my God, I'm gonna die. Oh my God, it's horrible. Oh, I have these nightmares, and yes, I'm traumatized, and oh, my kids are traumatized. However, you have the positives, and the positives are, gee, I'm alive. I have been given a second chance. I have been given a second life. And all of us, my wife and my children and myself, we all experience the same positive effects of the crash, which is we have to give back. We have to do something for others. We have to extend our heart out, our compassion to people who need it. It's almost therapeutic for us, The more you do for others, the better you're gonna feel. So for me, I figured, if I can extend my heart out to others, maybe it's gonna help me as well.